Welcome to one of the most disturbing mining disasters ever recorded in American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is as you listen to this account. We want to know what places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the winter of 1902, 14 men descended into the Blackstone mine in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado. It was supposed to be a routine shift in what was then one of the most productive silver mines in the state. By the time the sun set that evening, 11 of those men would be gone. The 3 who survived would never speak coherently about what happened in those tunnels. And the mine itself would be sealed forever, its entrance dynamited and buried under tons of rock and official silence. This is the story of the Blackstone mine disaster, a tragedy that the Colorado Bureau of Mines tried desperately to erase from history, a horror that mining companies across the West worked together to suppress, and a mystery that, more than a century later, still defies explanation. The town of Silverton, Colorado, sits at an elevation of 9,318 feet in a valley surrounded by the San Juan Mountains. In 1902, it was a booming mining town with a population of around 2,000 souls. The mountains surrounding Silverton were honeycombed with mines. Silver, gold, copper, and lead had been extracted from these peaks since the 1870s. When prospectors first began arriving in numbers after the Bruneau Treaty forced the Ute people from their ancestral lands. The Blackstone mine was established in 1887 by a consortium of investors from Denver. It was named for the distinctive black metamorphic rock that characterized its geology. The mine had been moderately successful, producing steady yields of silver ore for 15 years. By 1902, it employed 23 men across 3 shifts, working a main shaft that descended 800 feet into the mountain, with several lateral tunnels extending from the main shaft at various depths. The mine was owned by the Blackstone Silver Company, headquartered in Denver. The local operations were managed by Edmund Cartwright, a 52-year-old mining engineer, originally from Pennsylvania. Cartwright had worked in mines across the West for 30 years, and had a reputation as a competent, if somewhat harsh, manager. The foreman was a man named Jonas Whitmore, 38 years old, who had worked at Blackstone since its opening in 1887. Whitmore knew every tunnel, every timber support, every quirk of the mine's geology better than anyone. The morning shift on February 12, 1902, consisted of 14 men. According to the shift log preserved in the Colorado Mining Association archives, their names were Jonas Whitmore, foreman, age 38; Samuel Burke, age 29; Thomas McKenzie, age 34; Patrick O'Donnell, age 26; Wilhelm Schmidt, age 41; Carlo Benedetti, age 23; James Harrison, age 31; Robert Sullivan, age 28; Michael Chen, age 25; David Morrison, age 36; Henry Wallace, age 27; Frank Kowalski, age 37; Frank Kowalski, age 30. These men represented the diversity of Silverton's mining workforce: Irish, German, Italian, Swedish, Chinese. Men who had come west seeking fortune or fleeing poverty in their homelands. Most were experienced miners. Several had families in Silverton. They were ordinary men doing dangerous work for wages that barely supported their families. The shift began at 6 a.m. According to the time book, all 14 men clocked in between 5:45 and 5:58. The weather that morning was cold, but clear. The previous weeks had seen heavy snowfall in the mountains, but February 12th dawned with blue skies and temperatures just below freezing. Nothing in the conditions suggested any reason for concern. The plan for the day was routine maintenance and ore extraction from the 600-foot level. The main shaft descended vertically with stations at 200, 400, 600 and 800 feet. The richest silver vein at that time ran through the 600-foot level in a lateral tunnel that extended roughly 400 feet to the northeast from the main shaft. The men would ride the cage down to the 600-foot station, walk through the connecting tunnel to the active face, and spend the day drilling, blasting, and loading ore into carts that would be hauled back to the shaft and hoisted to the surface. At 6:15 a.m., according to the hoist operator's log, the cage descended with all 14 men aboard. This was confirmed by William Barrett, the hoist operator that morning. Barrett, who would later provide crucial testimony, noted that everything seemed normal. The men were in good spirits. Whitmore had reviewed the day's work plan with the crew before descent. There had been no complaints about equipment or conditions in the mine. The standard procedure was for the crew to reach the surface at 2 p.m. for the midday meal, then return for the afternoon portion of the shift until 6 p.m. Communication between the surface and the underground crews was maintained through a simple bell signal system. 1 bell meant stop the hoist. 2 bells meant raise the cage. 3 bells meant lower the cage. 4 bells was an emergency signal that had never been used in the mine's 15-year history. At 7:30 a.m., Barrett received a 2-bell signal from the 600-foot level. This was normal. It indicated the crew had unloaded and were beginning work. He noted it in his log and continued his duties. The next scheduled signal would typically come around noon when the men began preparing to return to the surface for their meal break. What happened next is where the official record begins to diverge from the testimony of those who survived. At 11:47 a.m., Barrett heard not the expected 2-bell signal, but a frantic, irregular clanging on the bell line. The sound was chaotic, not any recognized signal. He described it later as someone frantically yanking the rope without any pattern. Before he could respond, the bell signals stopped abruptly. Barrett, concerned but not yet alarmed, rang the bell from his end. No response. He tried again. Still nothing. Following protocol, he informed the shift boss, Martin Reynolds, who immediately went to find manager Cartwright. At 12:15 p.m., Cartwright arrived at the hoist house and was briefed on the situation. He made the decision to send down an investigation team. The afternoon shift was just arriving, and Cartwright selected 4 men: George Patterson, the assistant foreman, and 3 experienced miners: Andrew Thompson, Luis Ortega, and Samuel White. These 4 men descended in the cage at 12:30 p.m., equipped with extra lamps and a first aid kit. The investigation team reached the 600-foot station without incident. According to the testimony Patterson would give later, the station appeared normal. The ore carts were present, some loaded with rock. The tools were laid out, but there was no sign of the 14 men from the morning shift. Patterson sent up the signal for the cage to wait and led his team into the lateral tunnel toward the working face. The tunnel was approximately 6 feet high and 5 feet wide, supported by timber frames every 8 feet. It extended roughly 400 feet from the station to where the crew had been working. The investigation team walked about 200 feet into the tunnel when they began to notice something unusual. The temperature, which should have remained relatively constant at the depth they were at, seemed to be dropping. Their breath became visible in the lamplight. Patterson noted that the timbers along this section of tunnel appeared darker than normal, as if stained with something. At approximately 300 feet from the station, they found the first sign of the missing crew. A lunch pail belonging to Thomas Mackenzie was lying on the tunnel floor, its contents scattered. Near it was a pickaxe, its handle split as if it had been struck with tremendous force against something hard. Patterson called out. His voice echoed in the tunnel, but received no response. The team continued forward with increasing caution. The temperature continued to drop. Luis Ortega later testified that he could see frost forming on the timber supports, which should have been impossible at that depth. At approximately 350 feet from the station, they found more evidence. Several hard hats were scattered on the ground. A lantern lay smashed against the tunnel wall, and there were marks on the rock floor that Patterson described as drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled deeper into the tunnel. The team reached the working face at 400 feet. The scene that greeted them was, in Patterson's words, beyond comprehension. The face where the crew had been working showed fresh blast marks, indicating that blasting had occurred that morning as planned. But the newly exposed rock face displayed something that stopped the investigation team in their tracks. The rock was covered in symbols, not natural formations, not the result of mining operations, deliberate carvings or markings that appeared to have been in the rock before it was exposed by the blast. Patterson described them as geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. He noted that looking at them directly produced a sensation of vertigo and nausea. But more disturbing than the symbols was what lay at the base of the rock face. 3 men from the morning shift, Jonas Whitmore, Samuel Burke, and Patrick O'Donnell. They were alive but completely unresponsive. They sat against the tunnel wall, their eyes open and staring at nothing. They showed no reaction to the arrival of the investigation team, no response to being called by name, no indication they were aware of their surroundings. Of the other 11 men from the morning shift, there was no sign. Patterson immediately signaled for the cage to be lowered and for additional help. The 3 unresponsive men were carefully moved to the cage and brought to the surface. Dr. Henry Mitchell, Silverton's physician, was summoned immediately. He examined the 3 men at the mine office and found them physically unharmed. No injuries, no signs of trauma, but they were completely catatonic. Their eyes tracked movement slightly, but they did not speak, did not respond to commands or questions, and seemed to be in a profound state of shock. Meanwhile, Cartwright organized a larger search party. By 3 p.m., 8 additional men had descended to the 600-foot level. This expanded team searched not only the lateral tunnel where the morning shift had been working, but also explored other passages at that level, and the levels above and the levels above and below. They found absolutely no trace of the 11 missing miners, no bodies, no clothing, no equipment beyond what had already been discovered. It was as if 11 men had simply vanished from a sealed tunnel deep underground. The search continued through the night and into the following day. Every accessible passage in the mine was explored. The company brought in additional miners from other operations in the area. By February 14th, nearly 40 men were involved in the search, working in shifts around the clock. They found nothing, no additional evidence, no sign of the missing men. The only anomaly they consistently reported was the unusual cold temperature in the lateral tunnel at the 600-foot level, and the disturbing symbols on the newly exposed rock face. Several members of the search teams reported feeling watched while in that tunnel. Some described hearing sounds that had no obvious source, whispers or distant scraping noises that seemed to come from within the rock itself. On February 15th, 3 days after the disappearance, Edmund Cartwright made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered the lateral tunnel at the 600-foot level to be sealed. A crew spent the next 2 days building a brick wall across the tunnel entrance at the 600-foot station, effectively cutting off access to the entire lateral passage where the morning shift had vanished. Cartwright justified this decision by claiming the tunnel was structurally unsound and posed a danger to any additional search efforts. But miners who had been involved in the search disputed this claim. The tunnel had been properly timbered and showed no signs of instability. The real reason many suspected was that Cartwright had been ordered by company headquarters in Denver to contain whatever had happened in that tunnel. The 3 survivors, if they could be called that, remained catatonic. They were moved to the miners' hospital in Silverton, where Dr. Mitchell continued to care for them. For 2 weeks, they showed no change. Then, gradually, they began to emerge from their unresponsive state. Jonas Whitmore was the first to show signs of recovery. On February 28th, 16 days after the incident, he began to speak. His words were fragmented and often incoherent, but certain themes emerged. He repeatedly mentioned the cold. He spoke of symbols that moved. Most disturbingly, he claimed that the other men had not disappeared, but had been taken through the rock itself. Samuel Burke regained consciousness on March 3rd. His account was similarly fragmented, but he added details about a sound they had heard after the blast. A sound he described as something breathing on the other side of the stone. He also mentioned that the symbols on the rock face had begun to glow faintly just before he lost consciousness. Patrick O'Donnell took longest to recover. He did not speak until March 9th, nearly a month after the incident. When he finally did speak, his account was the most detailed and the most disturbing. He described how the morning shift had proceeded normally until they set off the blast to expose new ore. When the dust cleared and they approached to inspect the result, they saw the symbols on the freshly exposed rock. The crew had been confused and disturbed by these markings, but Whitmore had ordered them to continue work. Then, according to O'Donnell, the temperature in the tunnel began to drop dramatically. Frost formed on the rock walls. Their breath came out in thick clouds, and the symbols on the rock face began to change. They appeared to move, to rearrange themselves into different patterns. The men had backed away, frightened now. That was when they heard the sound Burke had mentioned. Something breathing, a deep, slow, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. O'Donnell claimed that the rock face itself began to change. The solid stone became fluid, like thick water, and shapes began to emerge from it. Dark shapes that he could not properly describe because they hurt to look at directly. These shapes had reached out and grabbed the men nearest the face. O'Donnell, Burke, and Whitmore had been furthest away and had turned to run. He remembered intense cold, more extreme than anything he had experienced. He remembered his legs becoming numb and collapsing, and then he remembered nothing until waking up in the hospital. These accounts were documented by Dr. Mitchell in his medical notes, which were later discovered in the archives of the Silverton Public Library in 1967. However, at the time these testimonies were given, they were not made public. The official story released by the Blackstone Silver Company stated simply that 11 miners had been lost in a catastrophic tunnel collapse at the 600-foot level. The collapse had been so complete that recovery of the bodies was impossible. The 3 survivors had been knocked unconscious by the initial collapse and were fortunate to have been far enough from the collapse point to survive. This official narrative was accepted by most people in Silverton, though the mining community was skeptical. Miners knew that a collapse severe enough to utterly destroy 11 bodies would have left obvious evidence. There would have been displaced rock, broken timbers, and dust. The 600-foot station would have shown signs of the catastrophe. But, according to everyone who had been down there, the station was undisturbed. The families of the missing miners were given death certificates and modest payments from the company. Funerals were held, though there were no bodies to bury. The men were memorialized in the Silverton Cemetery with a shared headstone that read, "In memory of 11 brave miners lost in service, February 12, 1902. Their names were listed, and the stone remains there to this day." The Blackstone mine continued operations, but the 600-foot level remained sealed. Work continued at the 400-foot and 800-foot levels for several more years. However, the mine never recovered its previous productivity. Workers reported being reluctant to descend below the surface. Some claimed to hear sounds from behind the sealed brick wall at the 600-foot station. Others reported sudden drops in temperature and feelings of being watched while working in the lower levels. In 1905, 3 years after the disaster, Jonas Whitmore committed suicide. He hanged himself in his home in Silverton. He left a note, but its contents were never made public. His widow, Mary Whitmore, told neighbors that Jonas had never recovered from what happened in the mine. He suffered from terrible nightmares and would often wake screaming about things coming through the stone. Samuel Burke left Silverton in 1906 and moved to California. He found work in agriculture and tried to put his mining days behind him. In 1919, he was interviewed by a journalist researching the disaster. Burke refused to discuss the details but made one enigmatic statement. "Some doors should never be opened. Sometimes we drill through and expose things that should remain buried." The interview notes are preserved at the University of California, Berkeley. Patrick O'Donnell remained in Silverton, longest of the three survivors. He continued working as a miner but refused to ever go underground again, limiting himself to surface work. In 1912, he gave an interview to a mining safety inspector in which he elaborated slightly on his earlier account. He described the symbols they had seen on the rock face in more detail, drawing some of them from memory. These drawings showed geometric patterns that don't match any known mining symbols or geological formations. O'Donnell also mentioned that in the days before the disaster, several members of the crew had reported having vivid nightmares about being underground, about cold darkness, and about something waiting beneath the rock. The Blackstone mine finally ceased operations in 1918. The silver vein had played out, and the company declared the mine economically non-viable. Rather than simply abandoning it, as was common practice with many mines of that era, the company took extraordinary steps to seal it permanently. The main shaft was filled with debris and capped with concrete. The entrance buildings were demolished. Most significantly, the entrance to the mine itself was sealed with dynamite. Multiple charges were set to collapse the first 100 feet of tunnel, ensuring that the mine could never be reopened without massive excavation. This aggressive closure raised questions at the time. Mining claims were valuable, and companies typically maintained their properties against the possibility of reopening if metal prices rose. But the Blackstone Silver Company seemed determined to ensure the mine would never be accessed again. Some suspected this was related to what had happened in 1902, that the company wanted to permanently bury whatever was down there. The official records of the Colorado Bureau of Mines contain a report on the 1902 disaster that closely follows the company's official narrative of a tunnel collapse. However, in 1954, a researcher named Dr. Albert Vance discovered a second contradictory report in the Colorado State Archives. This report, marked confidential and dated March 1902, was written by a state mining inspector named Howard Gaines. Gaines' report described his investigation of the disaster and concluded that the official narrative was false. He stated that there was no evidence of any tunnel collapse. He documented the testimonies of the survivors, which contradicted the company's story. He described the sealed tunnel and questioned why it had been closed so quickly. Most significantly, he recommended a state-led investigation into unusual geological phenomena at the site, suggesting that something beyond standard mining hazards had caused the tragedy. This report was apparently ignored or suppressed. Gaines himself died in 1907 in what was officially ruled a mining accident, though the circumstances were suspicious. He was found dead at the bottom of a mine shaft in Cripple Creek, despite the fact that he had been conducting a surface inspection at the time and had no reason to be underground. The story of the Blackstone mine might have ended there, buried under tons of rock and decades of silence, if not for what happened in 1958. That year, a group of spelunkers and amateur cave explorers from the Colorado Mountain Club discovered what they believed to be a natural cave entrance about a quarter-mile from the sealed Blackstone mine entrance. The cave entrance was well hidden, located behind a rockfall in a narrow canyon. The group explored the cave and found that it connected to old mine workings. Following these workings, they eventually reached a brick wall, the seal that Edmund Cartwright had ordered, built in 1902 at the 600-foot station. The group reported their discovery to the Colorado Historical Society, thinking they had found an interesting piece of mining history. But their report also caught the attention of other interested parties. According to one member of the spelunking group, Michael Anderson, they were visited shortly after their discovery by men claiming to be from a mining company interested in reopening the Blackstone claim. These men offered to pay the group a substantial sum for detailed maps of the route they had found. Anderson, suspicious of the offer, declined and made copies of the group's maps and notes, which he kept separate from the originals. In March 1959, the Colorado Mountain Club organized another expedition to the Blackstone workings, this time with better equipment and a larger team. They planned to systematically map the accessible tunnels and document the historical significance of the mine. But when they arrived at the cave entrance they had used the previous year, they found it had been collapsed. Someone had used explosives to seal the natural cave opening, making access impossible without major excavation. The group attempted to find alternate routes but were unsuccessful. They also discovered that the land around the old mine site, which had been owned by the defunct Blackstone Silver Company, had recently been purchased by an entity called the Western Properties Trust. This trust had no apparent business operations and seemed to exist solely to own this particular piece of land. When Anderson tried to research the trust, he found that its ownership was concealed behind multiple layers of corporate structure. Anderson became convinced that someone was actively working to keep the Blackstone mine sealed and inaccessible. He spent several years investigating, interviewing old-timers in Silverton, searching archives, and trying to uncover the truth about what happened in 1902. In 1963, he published a small booklet titled The Blackstone Mystery through a local press. The booklet compiled his research and argued that the official story of the disaster was false, that 11 miners had not died in a collapse, but had encountered something in the mine that the company and possibly government authorities had wanted to cover up. The booklet had limited distribution and was largely ignored by mainstream audiences. However, it did attract some attention from researchers interested in unusual phenomena. One of these was Dr. Margaret Chen, a geologist at the Colorado School of Mines. Dr. Chen became intrigued by Anderson's description of the symbols found on the rock face. She began researching unusual geological formations and discovered several other documented cases of mines or cave systems where similar markings had been found. Dr. Chen published a paper in 1968 titled Anomalous Geological Formations in Deep Mining Operations. Dr. Chen published a Pioneers or geological formations. The paper carefully avoided sensationalism, but documented several cases where miners had reported unusual phenomena at depth, unexplained temperature changes, strange sounds, and unusual markings on freshly exposed rock. She noted that these incidents were rarely officially reported, and that mines where they occurred often closed shortly afterward. The Blackstone mine was one of several cases she cited. The paper generated some academic interest, but was ultimately dismissed by mainstream geology. Critics argued that the reported phenomena could all be explained by natural causes. Temperature changes by groundwater movement, sounds by settling rock, and the markings by unusual mineral deposits or pareidolia, the tendency to see patterns where none exist. Dr. Chen, however, remained convinced that something more was occurring. In private correspondence with colleagues, preserved in her papers at the Colorado School of Mines archives, she expressed frustration at the lack of serious investigation into these phenomena. She wrote in one letter, "We assume we understand the geology of our planet, but we have barely scratched the surface. We drill down a few thousand feet and think we know what's below. But what if we're wrong? What if there are spaces, voids, or structures in the deep rock that we don't understand? And what if sometimes we break through into those spaces?" In 1972, Dr. Chen organized a research expedition to Silverton with the goal of locating and studying the sealed Blackstone mine. She obtained permission from the Western Properties Trust by representing her intentions as purely geological research. The trust, perhaps believing that enough time had passed, granted limited access to the property. Dr. Chen's team spent 2 weeks at the site, They used ground-penetrating radar and other instruments to map the underground structure of the sealed mine. The results were puzzling. The radar showed what appeared to be a large void space at approximately the depth where the 600-foot level should be located. But the void was larger than the documented tunnels should have been. Dr. Chen described it as an anomalous cavity that doesn't match the mine plans. The team also recorded temperature measurements at various points around the site. They found several locations where the temperature was significantly lower than expected, even accounting for elevation and season. One measurement point, directly above where the sealed lateral tunnel should be, showed a temperature of 15 degrees Fahrenheit, colder than surrounding areas. Dr. Chen wanted to excavate and attempt to access the sealed workings, but her permits did not allow this. She applied for an extension to her research authorization, but the Western Properties Trust denied it and revoked her access to the property. She was informed that the land was being considered for development and that further research would not be permitted. Frustrated but undeterred, Dr. Chen compiled her findings into a report that she intended to publish. However, before she could do so, she died in a car accident in April 1973. Her vehicle went off a mountain road near Silverton in circumstances that the police report described as consistent with loss of control on an icy curve. Some of Dr. Chen's colleagues questioned this conclusion, noting that she was an experienced mountain driver and that the weather that day had been clear and dry. Dr. Chen's research materials were donated to the Colorado School of Mines library by her family. However, when researchers tried to access them in later years, they found that key documents were missing. The ground-penetrating radar data, her detailed notes about the anomalous cavity, and her draft report had all been removed from the collection. The library had no record of who had accessed the materials or when the documents had disappeared. The Blackstone mine site remained sealed and inaccessible. The Western Properties Trust continued to own the land, paying property taxes but conducting no apparent business operations. Several attempts by different parties to purchase the land were refused. In 1989, a mining company offered to buy the property for a price well above market value, presumably hoping to explore whether any silver remained. The trust refused the offer without explanation. In 1995, journalist Kevin Martinez of the Denver Post became interested in the Blackstone story. He had grown up in Silverton and heard local legends about the cursed mine. As an adult and a professional journalist, he decided to investigate whether there was any truth behind the legends. Martinez spent 2 years researching the story. He tracked down descendants of some of the miners involved. He found and interviewed Michael Anderson, then elderly but still convinced that something extraordinary had happened at Blackstone. He obtained copies of archived documents, including Howard Gaines' suppressed report and Dr. Chen's surviving research materials. In 1997, he published a long-form article in the Post titled "The Men Who Vanished: The Blackstone Mine Mystery." The article presented the most comprehensive account of the disaster to date. It included interviews, archived documents, and photographs of the sealed mine site. Martinez carefully avoided making sensational claims, but presented the evidence that the official story was false, and that something unusual had occurred in that mine in 1902. The article generated significant interest. It was picked up by several other publications and discussed on radio programs. For a brief time, there was renewed public attention on the Blackstone case. But then, something strange happened. The Denver Post received a letter from a law firm representing the Western Properties Trust. The letter claimed that Martinez's article contained defamatory statements and demanded a retraction. The Post, rather than fight, agreed to remove the article from its archives and cease distribution. Martinez was reassigned to other stories and discouraged from pursuing the Blackstone investigation further. Martinez, however, kept his research materials. In 2003, he published a book titled "Shadow Mining: The Blackstone Disaster," and other buried mysteries. The book expanded on his article and included several other cases of unusual mining incidents in Colorado and neighboring states. He drew connections between these incidents and suggested that the mining industry, and possibly government agencies, had a history of suppressing information about unusual phenomena encountered at depth. The book was published by a small press and received minimal distribution. Reviews were mixed, with some praising Martinez's research while others dismissed the book as conspiracy theory. Martinez died in 2011, and no updated edition of his book was ever published. The most recent chapter in the Blackstone story occurred in 2019. A group of urban explorers managed to locate and access what they believed to be one of the natural cave systems that connected to the old mine workings. They documented their exploration with video cameras and posted footage online. The footage shows the group navigating narrow cave passages and eventually reaching what appeared to be old timber supports, indicating they had entered mine workings. They follow these workings for some distance before reaching a brick wall, presumably the seal from 1902. The footage shows them examining the wall and discussing whether to attempt to break through it. Then something unusual occurs in the video. The temperature, which the group had been monitoring with digital thermometers, suddenly drops. One team member notes that it has gone from 55 degrees to 32 degrees in less than a minute. The group also reports hearing sounds from beyond the wall. They describe it as something like breathing or rhythmic movement. At this point, one team member becomes suddenly agitated and insists they need to leave immediately. The others seem confused by this reaction, but they agree to retreat. As they are backing away, the video captures something strange. For just a few frames, barely visible in the poor lighting, there appear to be markings on the brick wall, geometric patterns that seem to glow faintly. The video quality makes it impossible to see them clearly, but several viewers who analyzed the footage claimed the patterns matched the symbols that Patrick O'Donnell had drawn in 1912. The group exits the cave system and posts their footage online. The video gains some attention in urban exploration and paranormal communities, but within 2 weeks, it was removed from all major platforms. The group reported that they received threatening messages demanding they delete all footage and never return to the location. They also claimed that one team member, the one who had insisted they leave immediately, had subsequently experienced psychological problems and refused to discuss what happened in the cave. This brings us to the present day. The Blackstone mine remains sealed. The Western Properties Trust still owns the land. The 11 miners who vanished in 1902 are commemorated by a headstone in Silverton Cemetery, but their fate remains officially unexplained. What really happened in that tunnel at the 600-foot level? The official explanation of a tunnel collapse is clearly false. The testimonies of the survivors suggest something far stranger. They spoke of symbols that moved, of impossible cold, of solid rock becoming fluid, and of shapes emerging from stone. These descriptions sound like the ravings of traumatized and confused men, but they are consistent across all 3 survivors, and they align with the observations of the investigation teams who found the scene. The most disturbing possibility is the one that Edmund Cartwright seems to have believed, that the miners, while blasting to expose new ore, had inadvertently broken through into something. Not another tunnel or a natural cave, but something else. Something that existed in the rock itself, or perhaps in some space that intersects with our physical reality in ways we don't understand. The symbols on the exposed rock face suggest that whatever was there had been encountered before, long before the Blackstone miners broke through in 1902. Perhaps by earlier peoples who marked the location as a warning. Perhaps by something not human that left messages in stone. The cold that everyone reported, the sound of breathing, the transformation of solid rock into something fluid. These phenomena don't fit any known geological or physical processes, but they were reported by multiple witnesses, some of them experienced and level-headed mining professionals. And what became of the 11 men? The survivors claimed they were taken through the rock itself. Could they have fallen into a natural cave system that was hidden behind the rock face? Possible, but extensive searches found no such cavity. And the ground-penetrating radar studies, decades later, showed only an anomalous void, not a network of caves. Could they have been killed by some toxic gas released by the blast, with their bodies somehow lost or hidden? Possible, but why seal the tunnel so quickly and so permanently? Why suppress the investigation? Why maintain such tight control over the property for more than a century? The pattern of suppression is perhaps the most telling aspect of the case. From Edmund Cartwright's hurried sealing of the tunnel in 1902, to the disappearance of Howard Gaines' report, to the mysterious deaths and intimidation of researchers who got too close to the truth, someone has consistently worked to keep the Blackstone disaster hidden. Who? The mining company initially. Certainly, they had obvious motivation to avoid liability and bad publicity, but the Western Properties Trust that controls the land today appears to have no commercial interest in the property. It simply keeps it sealed and inaccessible. Who funds this trust? Who benefits from keeping the Blackstone mine closed? These questions have no public answers. There are those who believe that the government, perhaps military or intelligence agencies, has taken an interest in the Blackstone site and similar locations. The theory suggests that certain geological anomalies or intersections with unknown spaces might have strategic value or pose unknown risks. If solid rock can become permeable under certain conditions, if there are voids or spaces in the deep earth that don't appear on our maps, these would be matters of national security interest. Others believe that the explanation is simpler and more ancient. That there are places on Earth where the barrier between our world and others is thin, where things can cross over or where human activity can inadvertently open doors that should remain closed. The symbols on the rock face, if they truly existed as described, might have been warnings placed by those who knew about these thin places. Whatever the truth, 11 men vanished from a sealed tunnel in 1902, and 3 others emerged broken and unable to fully explain what they had witnessed. A mine that had operated safely for 15 years was abruptly and permanently sealed. Multiple people who investigated too closely met with suspicious fates, and the site remains guarded and inaccessible more than a century later. The families of the missing miners never received answers. Mary Whitmore, widow of foreman Jonas Whitmore, spent years trying to get the company to explain what really happened to the men. She was repeatedly stonewalled. When she threatened legal action, she was told that pursuing the matter would result in her losing the modest settlement the company had provided. She died in 1938, still not knowing the truth. In Silverton today, most people know the basic story of the Blackstone disaster. 11 miners lost in a tunnel collapse. It's a footnote in the town's mining history, not much different from several other tragic incidents that occurred during the boom years. But among the older families, among those whose ancestors worked in the mines, there is a different understanding. They speak of the cursed mine. They tell their children not to go near the old Blackstone site. They remember the old-timers who worked there and who said that the mine had always felt wrong, that there were sounds in the deep tunnels that didn't make sense, that sometimes you got the feeling you were working right next to something enormous and ancient, separated only by a thin layer of rock. If you visit Silverton today, you can find the memorial headstone for the 11 miners. The names are still legible, though the stone is weathered by mountain winters. People occasionally leave flowers there, though most don't know who the miners were or how they died. They just know it was a tragedy. and tragedy deserves remembrance. The sealed entrance to the Blackstone mine is on private property and not accessible to the public. But you can see the area from a distance. There's nothing remarkable about it. Just mountain slopes, rock, and scrub vegetation. No sign remains of the buildings that once stood there, or the men who worked and died there. Nature has reclaimed it, and perhaps that is for the best. 3 men went into the depths of the earth in February 1902, and came back changed, traumatized, unable to properly explain what they had seen. 11 others went into those same depths, and never came back at all. The rock closed over them, and they were lost to a mystery that has never been solved and perhaps cannot be solved. Sometimes we dig too deep. Sometimes we expose things that should remain buried. Sometimes we open doors that cannot be closed. The miners of the Blackstone knew this. They learned it in the worst way possible, and their story, suppressed and hidden though it has been, serves as a warning. The earth has depths we do not understand. There are spaces below that are not on any map. There are things that exist in those spaces, things that have been there far longer than humanity. And every so often, by accident or ambition, we break through and encounter them. When that happens, the best we can hope for is to seal the breach, cover it over, and hope that what lies below stays below. Because the alternative, allowing something from those depths to come up into our world, is too terrible to contemplate. The Blackstone mine is sealed. The tunnel at the 600-foot level is sealed. The symbols on the rock face are sealed behind brick and stone and the weight of a mountain. And perhaps that is where they should remain, forever. Some doors, once closed, should never be opened again. 14 miners descended into the Blackstone mine on February 12, 1902. 3 came back broken. 11 never returned. And deep in the mountain, behind layers of brick and collapsed stone, something waits in the cold darkness. Something that breathed once and might breathe again if anyone is foolish enough to dig too deep and break through that final seal. The mine is closed. The story is buried. But sometimes, on cold winter nights in Silverton, people say you can hear sounds from the mountain. Faint, rhythmic sounds like breathing, like something vast and patient waiting beneath the rock, waiting for the seal to fail, waiting for someone to dig too deep once again. This is the story of the Blackstone mine, a mystery that the powerful want kept secret. A tragedy that haunts the survivors and their descendants. A warning that remains relevant today as we continue to drill and dig and tunnel into the earth, never quite sure what we might encounter in the darkness below. 14 miners descended into the shaft in 1902. Only 3 survived. Oh, 1902. Only 3 survived. The cursed mine is revealed, but the truth remains buried deep in stone and silence and official denial. And perhaps that is where it should stay. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some doors are better left sealed. Some things that lie beneath should remain beneath, forever.